Good day, everyone. We are the Group 7, and the topic that we are going to discuss is about business risk and mitigation strategies. There are 7 business risks that we are going to discuss in this lesson. So, the first one is human capital risk. Second, project risk. Third, IP or intellectual property risk. Fourth, legal risk. Fifth, vendor organizational risk. Sixth, value risk. And the last one is force majeure risk. Each of the business risks will be presented by our reporters, namely Cabrigas Crisel, Clarissa Rodora, Dehol de Maxine, Lanyog Laura May, Poblete Ara May Nicole, Roda April Rose, and Tingson Sheila May. So let's start.
Hi everyone, my name is Crisel K.N.Y. Cabrigas and I'm going to discuss to you about the human capital risk.
It focuses on the technical risk involved with the thorny issues of equal employment opportunity, immigration, and foreign trade regulations. Equal employment opportunity or EEO means freedom from discrimination on the basis of protected classes such as race, color, national origin, religion, age, disability, or genetic information. Immigration can be expected to lead to more investment. It may result in greater demand for labor and thus increased wages and employment in the economy. Foreign trade regulations means any act that prohibits or restricts and empowers the President or any executive agency of the United States of America to prohibit or restrict the exports of financial transactions with any foreign country or foreign national. Each of these topics touches the BPO project on the margins and must be understood and managed properly. Onshore outsourcing usually has minimal human capital risk. Onshore vendors operate within the same country as the contractor, although they may be located in different city or state, and once a company designates a vendor for specific processes, the vendor becomes a part of the workflow, and it is strongly in the domestic BPO vendors' interest to understand and comply with all U.S. employment laws and regulations. Furthermore, the vendor is highly motivated to assist clients with any labor issues they may face as the result of engaging vendors in an outsourcing relationship. The human capital issues most likely to arise in an onshore outsourcing project are those associated with equal employment opportunity regulations. For example, BPO buyers must be especially careful when outsourcing results in reductions in force, or RIFs. RIFs is when an employee is let go from a company due to budgetary reasons, workforce planning initiatives, position eliminations, or other right-sizing events. Reductions in force are typically permanent because the roles of those let go are usually eliminated with the termination of employment, and such reductions must be handled in a manner that is transparently related to business interests and has not selectively targeted a protected class of individuals. Let's talk about labor-related risk. Other human capital risks associated with onshore outsourcing concern those that stem from collective bargaining and labor relations laws and regulations. Collective bargaining is the process in which working people, through their unions, negotiate contracts with their employers to determine their terms of employment. Labor relations laws are protections and safeguards to help ensure employees are safe and protected in the workplace. For example, the U.S. Supreme Court has established basic guidelines governing whether and when subcontracting should be deemed a mandatory subject of bargaining under the National Labor Relations Act, or NLRA. Beginning in the early 1980s, the National Labor Relations Board issued several decisions that created additional uncertainty when evaluating the bargaining status of our sourcing or subcontracting decisions. The NLRB's lack of clarity on the obligations of employers in collective bargaining is unlikely to be resolved anytime. To reduce risk, companies should consult with labor attorneys as part of the BPO opportunity analysis to determine the likely disposition of their preferred strategy and its implication for possible liability exposure. Labor attorney will represent both employers and employees in disputes and negotiations. However, labor laws focus specifically on industries with labor unions and their specialized rules and regulations. Labor attorneys will represent members of labor unions in cases against employers and in strike negotiations, as well as employers in cases against employees. Understanding labor laws in non-US countries. BPO buyers that use an offshore outsourcing vendor can benefit from an absence of many of the employment liabilities present in the United States. Since offshore vendors are located outside of the company's own country, and many foreign countries do not have laws governing matters such as workplace discrimination, sexual harassment, or privacy. Companies must understand the labor laws that govern their outsourcing vendor. Labor law states the rights and benefits of employees. Moreover, it also sets certain conditions such as required weekly rest, contributions, and the likes. It is important to understand this because not knowing the law is never going to be an excuse when you happen to violate one. India, for example, has a radically different system of employment law than the United States, under a much more restrictive concept called termination indemnity. Employers must follow a lengthy notification process before letting Indian employees go. They must also indemnify employees for some of the wages they would have earned if they had remained on the job. Failure to follow the appropriate process can result in fines for an employer operating in India. Additionally, employers cannot enter into contracts under which individual workers sign away such rights. Similar employment laws restricting an employer's right to terminate workers exist in many countries that are hotbeds for outsourcing. The more restrictive labor laws in foreign countries can limit the flexibility BPO buyers seek. For example, a BPO project management team may recognize the need to reorganize a vendor's process to improve it. In some countries, it can be difficult for a company to restructure or change its operating strategies. Even moving an employee to a new work site could be a challenge in the foreign vendor's regulatory environment. The ability to restructure the organization, which is taken for granted in the United States, can be more difficult and riskier in many foreign countries. Study vendor labor practices. The most important risk mitigation strategy regarding human capital is to vigorously scrutinize vendor labor practices during the selection phase. The BPO buyer can avoid future headaches by seeking vendors whose HR practices and policies resemble their own, because a vendor that is a good fit for your business will prevent stress in the long run. Beyond that, it is also important to assess the professionalism of the vendor in his HR procedures and policies. They should select someone that they can trust to be professional and help keep their business running smoothly. Choosing the wrong vendor can be expensive for the company and even damage their reputation. Remember that, whatever the type of outsourcing, the relationship will success only if both the vendor and the client achieve expected benefits. Sweatshop risk. HR risks associated with offshore outsourcing also include the potential implications of practices acceptable in the foreign jurisdiction but unacceptable to consumers in the United States. The most common example of this is the so-called sweatshop labor practices that have damaged the image of firms such as Nike and Walmart. A sweatshop is defined by the U.S. Department of Labor as a factory that violates two or more labor laws. Sweatshops often have poor working conditions, unfair wages, unreasonable hours, child labor, and a lack of benefits for workers. Working with foreign companies whose HR practices are patently offensive to U.S. consumer. Consumer sensitivities poses the risk of potential backlash and unfavorable word of mouth, and if that happens, the business will lose credibility and consumers will find another companies that has a good HR practices and will satisfy their needs. The BPO buyer, although not directly responsible for the offensive practices, is nonetheless considered to be an enabler because it has a contract with the vendor. To mitigate this risk, it is imperative that BPO buyers regularly assess the HR practices of the vendor. Better still, the buyer can protect itself by specifying minimally acceptable labor standards in the BPO contract. The contract should also emphasize the metrics that will enable the buyer to hold the vendor accountable to those standards.
That's the end of my discussion. Now, let's move on to our next presenter.
Hi guys, I'm Army Nicole Molinis Poblete and I'm going to discuss a project risk. Based on our module, project risks are defined as those that have the potential to prevent the BPO initiative from not providing the cost savings, strategic advantages, or productivity improvements anticipated. Therefore, project risk is the process we use to try to reduce the level of risk on our project and therefore increase the likelihood that we'll be able to deliver our project on time, to budget, and to specification set. Next, mitigating project risk. To mitigate project risk, the BPO buyer should first assess its readiness to undertake the outsourcing project before making the leap. There are three key factors to mitigating project risk. Number 1, organization's ability to adapt to change. Organizations with a poor track record in managing large-scale change are at the higher risk of project failure than those with a record of successful change management. An organization's record of success in this area reflects its culture and it's likely to be consistent in the BPO initiative. Number 2, presence of an internal BPO champion. An internal champion, especially one with a broad influence with the organization, can reduce project risk. This person can be relied on to work long hours and lay awake nights thinking about solution to project problems when the other members of PMT are sleeping well. Number 3, time available to make the transition and ramp up to full operational mode. In general, the less time available for the transition, the higher the risk. It is often not practical to move all of the process to an offshore BPO vendor at once. Buyers should increase the time available to implement a BPO transition, building on a success along the way. Risk of unrealistic expectation. Number 1, upward expectation management refers to the procedures the PMT follows to ensure that the organization's executive team is informed about the project risk, potential costs, and mitigation strategies. Managing senior leadership expectation is critical to the BPO project. Too high expectations among senior managers can lead to overly critical feedback and potential plug pulling on a project that cannot meet excessively lofty expectation. With the current level of media attention and hype that surrounds outsourcing, elevated and even unreasonable expectation among senior management should be expected. The PMT must ensure the senior managers are aware of the challenges an offshore BPO project faces and manage expectation accordingly. A good technique for communicating risk and managing expectation is to develop a BPO risk probability matrix. So here's the sample of BPO risk probability matrix. A simple way of visualizing and figuring out the overall level of risk is by using a risk matrix. There are many different types of matrices in use with varying degree of complexity. They can have many categories and different grades of risk. They may also have different ways of defining categories. Number 2, downward expectation management refers to the challenge of managing employees' expectation as the project unfolds. Number 3, horizontal expectation management refers to handling expectations of managers in non-outsourced function. Managing expectation horizontally means minimizing workflow surprises and bringing managers from the non-outsourced functions into the workflow design process. It would be disastrous to simplify launch a BPO project without first determining in detail the effects of process output changes on unit that depend on that output. Managers who are surprised by changes in data, quality, quantity, or timing will depend the integrity of their work units and may become obstructionists to the BPO project. And lastly, number 4, external expectation management refers to the process of dealing with expectations of customers, suppliers, and other stakeholders outside the organization who have a need to know. The PMT should manage suppliers in much the same way it managed the expectation of internal managers whose functions are linked via workflow to the outsourced process. Suppliers linked to the outsourced process should also be included in workflow redesign so they are aware of changes and know whom to contact in case of distractions or efficiencies. Managing expectation is not difficult, but this process is often overlooked because it involves proactive decision making and confronting problems before they arise. And that will be all. Once again, I'm Army Nicole Molinis Poblete, and I hope you understand what Project Risk is. Let's move on to the next presenter.
Good day everyone, I am Laura Meilano from BSBA MM2-1 and I am going to report IP risk or intellectual property
Before we
risk.
tackle this, let's first define intellectual property. Intellectual property, it is something such as an idea, invention, or process that comes from a person's mind. Most business have a significant amount of sensitive information about trade secrets, business plans, and proprietary business knowledge. Threats to information security, including theft by company insiders, former employees, and computer hackers abound. These are all the risks that tech compliance or BPO must protect. Let's talk about industry-specific guidelines. Some industry groups, such as banks and financial services firms, have developed stringent guidelines for organizations to follow to secure their proprietary information. The Bank Industry Technology Secretariat, or BITS, for example, released security guidelines as an addendum to an existing framework for managing business relationship with IT service providers. So, yung mga bangko at financial firms, hinar nila si BITS para maprotektahan ang mga information ng kanilang mga kliyente. Sa madaling salita, ang BITS ay isang BPO company. The BITS goal is to help financial services firms streamline the outsourcing evaluation process and better manage the risk of handling over control of key corporate systems to vendors. Dahil sa pagiging sibilisado ng ating mundo, mas lalo na dadagdagan ang mga risk sa ating business industry. Kaya ang BITS ay nag-develop ng isang working group na tinatawag nilang framework na kung saan in-update nila ang ilang mga bagay na dapat i-consider like disaster recovery, security audits and assessments, vendor management, and cross-border considerations. Now let's proceed to HIPAA, raises concern in healthcare. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, or HIPAA, is designed to protect confidential healthcare information through improved security standards and federal privacy legislation. They are the one who led to a host of security risk management concerns for healthcare institutions that outsource processes requiring electronic transmission of patient information. It defines requirements for storing patients' information before, during, and after electronic transmission. Just like in an ordinary business, healthcare also identifies compliance guidelines for critical business tasks such as risk analysis, awareness training, audit trail, disaster recovery plans, and information access control and encryption, enable for the patient information and the hospital to be safely secured. Let's move on to security standards in 3 areas that must be met to ensure compliance with the HIPAA security rules. These areas are: the first one is administrative safeguards, documented policies and procedures for day-to-day operations, managing the conduct of employees with electronic protected health information or EPI, and managing the selection, development, and use of security controls. It is for the people in the hospital. The second one is physical safeguards. Security measures meant to protect an organization's electronic information systems as well as related buildings and equipment from natural hazards, environmental hazards, and unauthorized intrusion. It talks about the assets of the hospital. The last one is technical safeguards. Security measures that specify how to use technology to protect EFI, particularly controlling access to it. It is of course the technology used for the safety of the hospital. These 3 areas are the one who must HIPAA protect to the IP risk that surrounds everywhere. Best practices and standards. Sa isang firm, merong 4 na possibility kung bakit na-access ng mga masasama ang information o intellectual property natin. Meron tayong 4. Ang una dyan ay duty, negligence, damage, and cause. Let's talk about the 4 possibilities. The first one is duties. Refers to whether the organization has a responsibility to safeguard information. Siyempre, yan ang unang-una. Kung ginagawa ba talaga natin ang ating trabaho? Sinisiguro ba natin na safe ang lahat ng information na ginagawa natin o ginagather natin at kinikip. Let's proceed to the second one. Negligence refers to an outright breach of the duty to safeguard information. Ito naman yung sinasabi nila na kapabayaan o di naman kaya hindi ginawa ng tama ang pagprotekta sa isang mahalagang information. The third one is damage. Refers to whether there is harm to someone, the plaintiff, as a result of negligence. Ito naman yung naging resulta sa kapabayaan na ginawa. For example, nalugoy yung isang company dahil nag-leak yung information o kaya nawala dahil na-hack. The last one of the four possibilities is cause. Cause refers to the question of whether the negligence led to or was the primary cause of the damage. Ito naman yung tanong o sanhi kung bakit nga ba nagkaroon ng IP risk sa isang firm. Dahil ba yun sa kapabayaan o sa damage na na-create ng kapabayaan? Many firms turn to managed security providers or MSPs to assist them in managing the risk. Good MSPs or managed security providers provide valuable analysis and reporting of threat events, supplementing the efforts of in-house security personnel. They do this by sifting through vast amounts of data in order to uncover, identify, and prioritize security vulnerabilities that must be addressed. The last topic for IP risk. The best MSP provide BPO buyers with number 1, the ability to compare and correlate multiple monitoring points and to distinguish between false positives and actual threats. Ito yung mabilis makaramdam at mag-analyze kung yung information ba ay karapat-dapat o ito ay isang banta. Number 2, skilled experts on duty around the clock to assess and react to each threat in real time. Ito naman yung marunong tumiming kung ano nga ba dapat na ilapat na aksyon sa mga banta. Number 3, the ability to combine existing technology with expert analysis to look for anomalous behavior. Ito yung pagsasama-sama ng technology at magaling na pag-analyze upang makakreate ka ng counter-attack sa mga hindi inaasahang banta. And the last one is the ability to develop custom monitoring for specific networks or systems, including the development of an attack signature for each new vulnerability threat. Ito yung mahusay sa pagmamonitor ng networks or system ng kliyente para madaling masolusyonan ang mga banta.
Hello guys, I hope you learned something from me, and we will now proceed to the next presenter.
Good day everyone, I am Redarcy Clarissa and I will tackle to you about the legal risk.
Legal risks associated with offshore outsourcing are legion, and their threat is made worse by the relative lack of legal precedent. So, what I'm going to emphasize here is the word legion, wherein it means that legal risks associated with offshore outsourcing are becoming bigger and even multiplying that make it worse because of their threat by lacking of legal laws.
So, for example, there currently are no clear legal rules governing the extent or scope to which solutions can get from a BPO vendor in the case of security breach and other gross malfeasance like information leakage or information loss. So, today, many law firms and consultancies specialize in assisting BPO buyers in developing contract terms. Law firms and consultancies ensure that those contract terms are highly favorable and enforceable, wherein each contract must foster and promote the PPO relationship, of course, between the buyer and the vendor. Then, in an offshore BPO project, the BPO buyer may have to concede some governing jurisdiction to the vendor's home country. So why do it has to be like that? It is for the reason that it may not be possible to draft contracts or agreements with offshore vendors that demand all legal conflicts be decided in the buyer's preferred jurisdiction. Next, PPO buyers should mix and match forums. On different contract elements, some give and take may be required with some potential areas of conflict to be decided in a domestic forum, some in a forum preferred by the vendor, and others in an international forum such as the International Arbitration Association. So, BPO buyers should mix and match forums to ensure that matters that have potentially greatest impact to competitive ability are decided in their preferred forum. And this can be achieved if there is a willingness to concede or admit that less important matters can be decided elsewhere. So, one technique that has been effective for avoiding legal disputes is to split outsourcing contracts depending on different deliverables and service level agreements. For you to know, service level agreements is a commitment between a service provider and a client. Some particular service aspect they both agreed are the quality, availability, or responsibilities. That's what it is. So for that, here is the example. Many firms outsource software development as well as IT management to third-party vendors. IT management services are governed by service level agreements that require regular fee payment, while software development fees should be payable at different milestones like having an advance payment, then payment after first development milestone, something like that until the acceptance of the final code. So, to avoid legal disputes, a BPO buyer should be wise to split the software development contract from the IT services contract because splitting the contract reduces the risk of financing the development of code that does not perform as expected. Lastly, firms should also be careful to separate continuous service or transaction-related terms from those that concern development of some type of output. Those continuous or transaction-related services are usually covered also in the service level agreements and are paid on a regular basis. So firms should treat the development contracts separately because it is reasonable for the BPO buyer to withhold a substantial portion of the development contract fees until the final product has been delivered and tested.
And that's what legal is all about, so let's move on to the next presenter.
Hi, I am the next reporter and my name is Maxine Vines M. De Holte. My report is about vendor organizational risk. Here, we will discuss what are the risks that may encounter in business process outsourcing and how can we mitigate those risks. Risk associated with vendor organization is considered as the most difficult to accept. Why? This is because they cannot be easily controlled. It is a long process wherein you identify as well as evaluate potential risks when working with a vendor. Next, the risk may vary from business practices to authenticity of certification and reference claims. This includes making decisions that are based on one's organization's policies, procedures, mission, and goals and needs as well. Next, In addition to that, there is a lack of transparency and credibility among business processes outsourcing companies. The risk concerning with this issue, the potential to overstate vendors' competency and exaggerate business and technical certifications. Next, human resource malpractice is also another risk associated with vendor organizational risk. This is due to the fact that a lot of manufacturers that choose to outsource or outweigh foreign businesses turn a blind eye to several labor practices that are already been long banned in the country of United States. How can we mitigate this risk? First, we have U.S. Foreign Corruption Practices Act of 1997. This mitigation can be used in United States for it is intended to discourage business practices that are prohibited in their own country. Furthermore, the said risk can be prevented by means of comprehensive thoroughness or diligence in management on unbiased proof of certifications. Hence, vendors that refuse to show evidences of certification to their clients are apt to be treated with such caution. Lastly, firms or business that considered outsourcing business processes must also take into account labor practices of the vendor with regards to the geographic location of the business. Meaning to say, participating in local malpractices overseas can greatly damage domestic reputation and goodwill. All in all, you have to know what are the risks that your business may encounter, especially in business process outsourcing. And also, you have to know how to prevent those risks. That's all for my report. Now, let's move on to the next presenter.
Good day everyone. My name is April Rose Esroda, reporter from Group 7. This time I will discuss to you the value risk.
Whether the rationale is cost savings or business transformation, an outsourcing project is undertaken to create value for the BPO buyer. With the myriad uncertainties inherent in any complex BPO deal, extracting anticipated value can be a challenge. This risk can be mitigated through several techniques, most of which center on managing the projected outcomes. For example, if the outsourcing deal is expected to save the BPO buyer 1 million in the first year, the PMT should manage to do that figure. Adding extra people or hiring consulting firms may be a temptation to them habang lumalaki yung paghihirap na ginagawa nila para magawa yung project na yon. But this temptation can be resisted if the PMT is committed to hit the cost savings target established for the project. Another technique for mitigating project value risk is to empower the PMT to constantly seek opportunities to leverage the competencies that develop between the buyer and the vendor firms. This tactic, often referred to as pressing the value model, will expand the reach of vendor competencies as well as those jointly developed through the BPO relationship. Value risks are inherent in any project as people strive to work together to achieve future organizational states. Working with international vendors presents higher value risk than does working with domestic vendors, in that the extent of potential value is often overstated by the foreign vendor and can take longer than expected to achieve. The project management plan can also be an important tool for mitigating value risk because it specifies tasks and responsible parties that can be held accountable on one-to-one basis. The PMT should have provisions in place for emergency meetings in the event that value goals are not being reached.
That is the end of my discussion. Let's move on now to the next reporter.
Hi, my name is Sheila May M. Tingson, and I'm going to discuss force majeure risk. Force majeure risks are the most difficult to quantify and specify. This is the risk of loss to a company from an act of God. Ito ay karaniwang takda sa mga kontrata na nagpapawala ng pananagutang legal o obligasyon sa mga nagkasundong panig kung sakasakaling may mangyaring kaganapang hindi nila kontrolado, gaya ng digmaan, welga, kaguluhan, krimen, o isang kaganapan na kung ituring ay gawa ng Diyos, tulad ng bagyo, baha, lindol, pagsabog ng bulkan, at iba pa, na humahadlang sa mga panig na isakatuparan ang mga obligasyon na nakasaad sa kontrata. Sa katunayan, karamihan sa mga takdang force majeure ay di nagpapawalang pananagutan sa panig sa pagtupad ng kontrata. Bagkus, pansamantala lamang itong ipagpapaliban habang nagaganap pa ang force majeure. The risk can be estimated with some measures of objectivity, and an appropriate mitigation strategy can be developed and enacted. Planning for political unrest. Global geopolitical realities have brought the threat of war to nearly every doorstep. At the same time, reasonable assessments of the probability of war affecting a BPO vendor can be made. And Business Monitor International provides extensive coverage of the political, economic, and military risks that exist for every countries around the world. So, its website provides a starting place for assessing the war risk associated with the home country for BPO vendor. Another great source of country-specific information is the U.S. Department of State website. It has extensive information for travelers and business people that can help them determine the risk associated with regions worldwide. The potential for political unrest exists in many countries that are desirable outlets for outsourcing, such as India and the Philippines. Firms outsourcing to foreign countries should plan for the possibility of war and the impact of such a conflict would have on their business. So, mas maganda na magkaroon tayo ng backup na pupuntahan in case na magkaroon ng disaster para hindi tayo masaktan o mapahamak. Such plans force organization to examine possible risks and are crucial if the outsourcing firms want to purchase insurance to cover property, liability, or business interruption exposures. For example, do you know the SARS outbreak? It is the severe acute respiratory syndrome. The outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome affected several companies that outsourced functions, especially those based in China. But the effects of SARS were felt in the United States too. Companies that had employees working in China when the SARS outbreak occurred had to move those companies back to the United States or have them quarantined. In addition, companies in the United States that received packages from China were concerned about opening them in case the disease could spread. The SARS outbreak illustrates the importance of planning for unusual and unexpected events. Companies needs to understand the flow of their business and how each function of operation could be affected by an unusual event. Planning for disaster and recovery. There is a way to recover from disaster. First, companies that outsource overseas need to develop disaster recovery and business continuity plans. Second, it is a good idea to have a backup in place in case anything goes wrong with infrastructure, business partners, or distribution channels. Third, In addition to a backup, BPO buyers should consider drawing up a contract with the company responsible for securing the outsourcing. The term of the contract and the shifting of the risk can be governed by that document. Here is the sample language for disaster recovery. Scope and definition. The outsourcer shall develop and implement a plan for the prevention and mitigation of business interruptions due to natural and other causes. So, risk management means expecting and planning for the unexpected. To maintain the safety of staff and patients and ensure the viability of your practice, you need to prepare for unforeseen disasters. These risks may include criminal activity, natural disaster, cyber attacks, or terrorist attacks. Any one of these threats could be serious enough to devastate your practice, but if you have a readiness plan in place, you can work to minimize their impact. Having a plan in place serves the following purposes. First, to protect staff and personnel. Second, to protect sensitive patient information. Third, to protect revenue, assets, and information. Fourth, to prevent loss and to contain loss that occurs. Last, to protect your reputation. Next is outsourcers' responsibilities. Make all reasonable efforts to ensure the continuity of operations through implementation of a disaster recovery and business continuity plan. We need to develop a more detailed and comprehensive plan to ensure business continuity in the event of natural or other event that may cause service, supply chain, delivery, or performance interruptions. The plan must address these activities that are necessary to resume operation at the optimal level at an alternative location. We also need to consider managing risk early. Outsourcing does not mean eliminating business risk. It simply means that some risk is transferred to the BPO vendor. BPO buyers should consider whether they could go back to their old system if all else failed. To be effective, an outsourcing deal requires that each partner has considerable benefits to begin, and that means sharing both risks and rewards. To make that work, the BPO deal must fund the necessary investment and motivate each partner's commitment by aligning goals. When thinking about using outsourcing, the buyer must also consider the risk it brings to a potential BPO relationship. The BPO provider's readiness to undertake a BPO project is a major determinant of risk to project success. A good starting point to a risk management strategy is for the potential buyer to develop a risk profile of itself. Here are the 5 questions that you need to answer after you watch the video. So once again, we are the group 7 and we hope that you learned something today from our discussion. Thank you and God bless.